Pause.
Sounds great.
Okay, so good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Andrew. I'm one of the senior academic consultants at National Geographic Learning, although I am not the presenter of the webinar today. Today we have the wonderful Carmela joining us all the way from Japan to be able to go over some new ideas. So Kinsho, excited to learn new stuff, and that's what you're going to get today. So without further ado, I'm going to quickly introduce Carmela so you know a little bit more about her if you don't already. Carmela is the Assistant Director in charge of Globalization and a Professor at the Center for Foreign Language Education at Shimane University in Japan. She's been teaching for more than 20 years, and she's helped develop several new courses at the university, including Global Literacy, Global Leadership, Global Interaction, and Global Understanding. She's also been working with many different companies, including National Geographic Learning, to author textbooks, worksheets, workbooks, and lots of other things as well. She's very prolific in what she does. So we're lucky to have some time with her today. So Carmela, I'm going to hand things over to you and let you get started.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone who's joined, for giving an hour of your time. I know as teachers, we're so busy. And I appreciate that you want to learn more. And I hope that you'll be active in the chat box, ask questions, answer my questions, and that this can be as interactive as possible. I am going to be talking about some activities to help us think about intercultural communication and how we can better prepare our students for that. But before I talk about that, it's nice to meet you. First time. Thank you. Before I talk about the activities, I want to sort of give a little bit of a framework. So to understand why I do these activities or what has sort of led to them. So the first is a story about a student, and I'm going to call her M. So if you have a student like this, feel free, as I'm telling the story, to say in this chat box, me too, or I have a student like that. Let me say all my students aren't like this, but I think as teachers, we always have these students. So in the case of M, she was an advanced student. This was probably 10 years ago, maybe even a little bit more. She was in a class with exchange students, including a student from France, and they were having pair discussion. And in context, she said something with the word grave, but he didn't understand it. So he said, "What?" And she repeated herself. It's natural. That's what you do. But he still didn't understand. So I went over to them. They were doing pair work. And I said, M, why don't you say the idea a different way? And she said, okay. So I walked back, gave her some space, but kept watching as I was also working with other pairs. The silence came over them. The French student seemed patient, but didn't do anything to help her. She started kind of sinking down in her chair. She got a little quieter. And after a minute or two, she said the exact same sentence. Third time was not a charm. He still didn't understand. And then after another minute, she said it again. So I stepped in again and I said to the French student, a grave is a place where we put a dead body. And he said, oh, what's that word? The look on Maya's face was absolutely priceless because she was convinced the problem was her pronunciation. It wasn't his fault. It never occurred to her that she knew words that he didn't know. It never occurred to her that communication was two-way. So she was taking 100% responsibility for the breakdown in communication. But you and I know that communication requires, you can relate. Yeah, thank you, Andrew. We know that communication requires two people and that the French student could have done something to try and facilitate that. But she was taking 100% responsibility. I also have students on the other spectrum who don't take any responsibility. It's their fault. I had a student last year say he, talking about a student that she had been chatting with and was having a little problems communicating with, he should watch more TED Talks. She kind of launched into why he should watch more TED Talks. And I said, but what can you do? So these two students have really sort of informed some of my ideas, especially M, that students don't always think of communication as two-way. They might take all the responsibility or none of the responsibility. And M just didn't have the skills that she needed to overcome this grave problem. And the French student, advanced learner as well, didn't have the skills to sort of help her facilitate, move on. So this has been really instrumental in me thinking about what do students need to be better prepared for intercultural communication. The second thing that has really been formative in these activities and a lot of my classroom activities and the things that I do is a questionnaire survey that a colleague and I did. The first thing I want to do is share this poll with you. Can you see the poll, everyone? Could you please complete this? I want you to think about how your students would respond. So in the poll, it says, in case you're going to be watching the video, when awkward gaps or sudden silences occur, just like with M, Asians in general don't have the skills to fill them. When we trialed before this study, we found out that we couldn't ask students directly, do you have the skill? Because students might become defensive, which is natural. It's understandable. We did a lot of trialing in 2 different countries. And what we found is that if we asked about Asians generally, although it's kind of hard because Asia is huge, it opened up the topic for students so they could start thinking about it. And then we could ask them some more questions. We gave this questionnaire in students' first language in 13 different countries and areas, especially East Asia and Southeast Asia. So I'm just going to give you another second to complete the poll, and then let's have a look at what you're saying. After that, I'm going to share some of the results. I didn't bring in the results from all 13 countries because it would be this tiny on the screen, but I just picked out 3. And luckily, we have people from all 3 countries that are here. So I definitely would love to have your feedback in the chat box about the results when you think about them, when you see them. So let's have a look at the poll. Let's see. Here are the results. Wow, lots of agreement. Thank you for that. No one strongly disagrees. A little bit of strong agreement, but a lot of agreement. So think about that as you see the students' results from 3 countries. Vietnam, Japan, and Thailand. Is there anything that you see that really stands out for you when you look at this? There are some big differences. If you look at this, you're going to see that the Vietnamese students and the Thai students had pretty opposite. Yeah, and the Japanese were pretty neutral. Exactly. Japanese were pretty neutral. We had interviews to talk with students. Over 1,000 students we interviewed one-to-one. That's where we could find out, why were you neutral? Why did you agree? Because you and I know, even if we agree, we could agree for very different reasons. The other thing is, you might notice that, as I said, the Vietnamese students and the Thai students, very different. The Vietnamese students tended to disagree, that they said Asians have the skills, whereas the Thai students tended to say, yep, you're right, Asians don't have the skills. So very interesting difference, especially because we often tend to think, Vietnam and Thailand are right next to each other. Maybe students have similar opinions. They have some common culture, some common things. So this might be a little bit surprising. Another question we had on the questionnaire, which I'm going to share with you as a poll again, is to ask students, do they want to study? And I'd like you to, again, complete this poll. You and I know that if students want to study something, whatever it is, that they're going to tend to be more engaged, more motivated, more excited. They're going to see how it's important for them, applicable for them. And again, we wanted to find out, first of all, do students want to study this? And second of all, in those interviews, find out why they want to study it, how they want to study it, what other perceived gaps they have. The whole questionnaire was looking at intercultural communication and in what situation a student might use English or might choose not to use English. So really thinking about different aspects of intercultural communication. So I'm going to close the poll now and let's see what everyone says. Wow, fantastic. Even more agreement. 70% of you said agree. So you won't be surprised then to see that there was a lot more agreement among students in the 3 countries as well. If you look at this slide, the numbers don't go from smallest, the orange numbers from smallest to largest, because I've kept them in the same order as the previous slide about the Asians. So the gap between the Vietnamese and the Thai students has shrunk right down. Even though the Vietnamese said, no, Asians, maybe they tend to have that skill, they still want to study it themselves, which is exciting. So I want to mention just a couple things about these students, and specifically in the interviews when we talked about them, like, why do you want to study it? When we talked to students from many different countries, we had conversations like this. Why do you want to study it? I hate those gaps. Oh, I can relate to that. They become uncomfortable. We don't want to look silly or stupid or like we don't know what we're doing. We want to make sure we're confident. So pretty relatable, right? The students often said things like internal motivation. Yeah, thank you. Yes. Students said things like, neither of us knows what to do. If we think back to the situation with the grave, neither of them was able to overcome that problem until I stepped in. So this is something that we can think about, bring into the class and help students build these skills. Keep building them. It only has to take a minute or two, then just keep building the skills. I also want to mention in Thailand, and some of you are from Thailand, so this is exciting, 107 students were interviewed. And of those, 45 students said, I would deal with the gap by smiling or smiling and laughing. By itself, do you think that would get rid of the gap? It's not a bad technique. It's better than nothing because at least maybe some of the tension is going to go away. But by itself, it's not going to take care of the problem, right? The students also said things like, yeah, thank you, better than nothing. 18% of the students that we interviewed, because this was all open-ended discussion, right, said they wouldn't do anything. This is definitely where we don't want our students, like the French student, right? I don't think it's that he was deliberately not doing anything. I think he was worried that if he did something, it could upset her or make her feel bad. And he didn't want to make her feel bad. So helping students see how they can assist the conversation without making the other person feel bad, without it, to just make it very natural, is something that we want to facilitate with students. Only 14% of the students said they would do something very proactive. They said things like, I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to change the topic. Out of these 107 students, only one said things that we often teach in our class, things like choose easy words, rephrasing, paraphrasing, explaining. And this especially is something that I'm going to be talking about in just a few minutes, because this is something that we can do at the beginning of class, at the end of class, in the middle of class. It only takes a couple minutes, but we're going to keep developing those skills. I just want to mention 2 things before we jump into the activities. The first is that the data is a little bit old, but also, as you know, everything changed with COVID. And what's surprising is last year when I gave a very non-scientific study, I just gave it to some freshman students who I don't teach, but in my university, they were taking English class. They were in a mandatory English class. Even more students said, yeah, I want to study that. Again, that's exciting because we know that if they want to study it, it could be good for our class, right? So I wanted to mention that. And I also wanted to ask you, when you talk with your students about typical problems, that sort of get in the way of intercultural communication? Is there something they mention a lot? Of course, just like me, you are getting sort of feedback from students. You're asking them, at the end of an activity to sort of help you understand where they're at, connect the ideas together. But one thing I also do, and I'm sure many of you do, is give a questionnaire or reflection at the end of every class. By doing that, I can help students connect ideas together. If they have to summarize or they have to think about the idea and then they're revisiting it, it's reinforcing it. I can also ask them, do you have questions? Are there things you still don't understand? And that classroom feedback for the last 10 years has consistently shown the same kinds of issues that you and I have been talking about, that it's vocabulary, not being able to explain grave, having different vocabulary, not having enough confidence or losing confidence, pronunciation, M was convinced it was her fault, and speed. So these are things that I have been considering as I do these activities, because even young learners, people are people, right? So this also applies to young people, absolutely, because they can explain things sometimes better than those of us who have a very stiff definition of something and maybe don't use our language as well. So I want to jump into the first set of activities. And before I really do that, I want to share one more poll with you. I want you to think about your students and think about whether most of them know that English is a lingua franca. English is an international language. So some students, I think probably just like me, you have many different students across the spectrum. I have some students like M who absolutely know English is an international language. She loves, still now, I'm still in contact with her, talking with people from different countries, learning about different countries, using English as a tool for communication. But then we have some students who maybe don't realize this quite as much. For them, maybe English is still kind of a way to get a grade. It's a mandatory class. So they're not really thinking of English as an international language, as a tool, as a bridge between people who have different first languages. So that's why I, when necessary, depending on the students, and you know your students better than anybody else, you know where they need to start. But some students probably need to start just by realizing English is a lingua franca. That builds that foundation. So let's see what you said. Yeah, there's kind of a lot of agreement that most of your students know this. So for you, maybe this activity is not as important. But if you were some of the people who disagreed or you were neutral, this activity could be really helpful. And if you think that your students know English is an international language, you could still do this activity because it's just going to give more depth to their understanding. So this activity requires Kahoot or another online game. Another one would be fine. Does anybody know Kahoot? Has anybody ever used Kahoot? Kahoot allows students to play individually, in pairs, and groups. The thing is they each need a device. Oh, many people have played it. So you know, students become so excited, right? They become so excited. Students I was teaching some high school classes. Oh, you often use it. Fantastic. I was teaching some high school classes and introducing this concept of English as an international language to them. Yes, they absolutely become more attentive and more active. The students were out of their seats, jumping up and down. They were so excited because after every question, this leaderboard comes up and they can see who is number one, who is number two, who is number three. Very competitive. Again, the end of the class feedback, because we discussed the ideas in class, but the end of the class feedback was really valuable for me because I asked students to reflect and tell me what they learned. And I didn't mention things that I like specifics, but students repeated those specifics, so they remembered them. Students said things like, I was amazed that English is an official language in over 60 countries. So students who don't know that, that helps them realize like English has a lot more value than they might realize. English can be used in more places than maybe they've considered. One of the students in the feedback, actually more than one, said, I was shocked. I thought I could only use English with people from America and Australia. So sorry, Andrew, not even people from New Zealand, apparently. But now they know they can use English with people from all over the world, not just native speakers. In fact, students are more likely to communicate, and we as people, just anybody, are more likely to communicate with non-native speakers than a non-native speaker and a native speaker, unless you're talking to me. So the students became very aware of English as an international language and the value of studying English. And that laid the foundation for all of the amazing National Geographic learning materials. They have all these speakers from around the world. And the students started to realize, oh, I'm learning to understand different accents. I'm hearing different pronunciation. I'm hearing different vocabulary. So we often use American English in Japan, but oh, they used a different word because of, Japanese English being different than another country's English, choice of vocabularies, the vocabulary we study, but also British English. So this is one activity that you can do to sort of lay that foundation. If your students already know this, you might want to start with this next activity. The next activity focuses on food. Any content would be fine, but it needs to be something concrete, because what we want our students to do is focus on the opportunity for miscommunication, just to realize that even between people from their own culture, miscommunication can happen, because sometimes students don't realize that, and that miscommunication can happen over things that they consider to be universal, or things that they consider to be common, or things that they consider would never have differences. So what I do before we ever started studying the textbook is the students started brainstorming Japanese kinds of food, and we classified them into spring food, summer food, winter food. And I chose ozoni. Japanese ozoni is a soup that they eat during New Year's. And here you can see a picture. The table is set, and you can see in the center that ozoni is this ozoni in my area of Japan. So different areas of Japan have different kinds of ozoni. What I ask my students to do is get into pairs and imagine their partner was someone who didn't know Japanese culture at all, to explain their ozoni. It only took 1 or 2 minutes before, what? No, what? Chicken? Sweet? Fish? They were amazed. It was a revelation for them. They were surprised because they thought, for the most part, that maybe they knew what ozoni was, that it was the same, or maybe they knew of 2 kinds of ozoni, but there were lots of different descriptions of ozoni. So in the center picture is the ozoni in my area, which is sweet, has red beans, azuki, which we eat in Japan a lot, and it has mochi, pounded rice. In the rest of Japan, including my area, this is eaten as a dessert all year long. But in my area, this is ozoni. You can see in the last picture, the sort of creamy soup. That creamy soup is the ozoni just outside of Kyoto, but it's a white miso base. So students were explaining, some had vegetables, some didn't, some had chicken, some didn't. One student was from a fishing village. His ozoni had fish in it, which really is unusual. So students started to discover that when they have some assumptions, they sometimes need to check those. I assume that you and I are talking about the same ozoni, but actually, I'm talking about sweet ozoni and you're talking about fish. Number one, are we talking about the same thing? Number two, is ozoni different? So students get to start really thinking about how impressions could be different, how assumptions, perspectives, images can be different. Then throughout the semester, I tied back to this. Do you remember when we talked about ozoni? Now, when you have this free talk, if you and your partner have what seem to be different images, maybe you do. Maybe you need to step back and explain your image of something and see if it's the same. Because I sort of had this invisible thread going through the semester and I kept calling back to, do you remember that ozoni? They kept realizing that they were building on this skill. They understood that this wasn't a one-off thing, but this was something that was a life skill that they were going to be using for the rest of their lives and that they wanted to keep developing. So this is the second activity we can use with students. If your students, like some of my students, already really realize perspectives are different, of course they know that, some, but not all. When you get to a beautiful photo like this, you can just have them do some brainstorming and some describing. Does anybody know, can anybody tell me, what is this man carrying? Or if you don't know what he's carrying, what do you think it looks like? What do you think it doesn't look like? A big blob of bread dough. Absolutely. I think it looks like bread dough too. Any other ideas? Dough. Yes, exactly. Anybody else? Another guess? Ice cream. Somebody knows the answer. Yes, this is Turkish ice cream. Thank you for sharing that. It's Turkish ice cream. It's Turkish ice cream. Fantastic. Yes, thank you. But if you look at this Turkish ice cream, it might not be the same as your image of ice cream. So we can ask students to first brainstorm what this could be, and then to sort of compare and contrast, make some descriptions. So, ice cream that I usually eat, because I've never had Turkish ice cream that I usually eat is soft. This would be stiff. It melts. This doesn't look like it melts really fast because otherwise you can't carry it on a stick. It's soft and it melts and it's cold. So I don't know, I've never had Turkish ice cream, but one of my students in my class had. And that made it so much more exciting because the students saw that the real world, real life material that we're studying really is applicable to their lives. He had actually eaten it here in Japan. And he talked about, if you look on the internet, you can find all of these videos of the vendor pretending to put the ice cream into a cup. And then as they pass it to the customer, pulling the ice cream away. And it's a little game they play. And the student talked about that he saw that he experienced that. So anytime we have the opportunity to also just ask students, have you experienced this? Have you seen it? It just makes the learning so much richer because they're seeing how practical it is. So these are 3 activities, short activities that we can do to build the foundation before we start to get into some discussion skills. Again, I have 3 activities that are all based on really thinking about that grave issue and thinking about the Thai student who said, I'm going to use easier words. I'm going to try to help the person understand the concept. So as we're thinking about, they're going to have to understand the concept. First of all, they need to explain it. And second of all, there needs to be an understanding of what we just talked about, that maybe my image and their image is different. So for this first activity, it's all about technology, and it's about technology and jobs. I love this because students get to hear about someone and think about a job that maybe they would never think about. It's just another little aspect that we're giving to them to think about their life while they're studying English with amazing content. So as the students are studying this page, we get down to the video. And I'm going to show you this video in a second. It's so interesting. For my students, I ask them to make a mind map. And I do that for 2 reasons. The first is because they're still developing that skill. But the second is these activities all focus on, yeah, I love the high quality photos too. Thank you. The students need to focus on words. I don't know about your students, but my students tend to write sentences. But sentences won't help them focus on the words. We want them to think about explaining, rephrasing. So I asked them to make a mind map. I'm going to show you the video now. You don't need to make a mind map, but just notice some of the technology that he talks about. And then I'll tell you what happened in my class.
Technology helps me do my work, which is studying insects. When I'm in the field, I take a lot of pictures, so my camera is really important. Sometimes I can't use my camera, so I also bring two phones, which are lighter and easier to carry. I also use a laptop, of course, and I need a lot of batteries to keep everything working. What else? Well, in the places I go to study insects, the weather can be challenging. It can rain or snow a lot, and sometimes there are really big storms. So I need technology to keep me alive. And it's hard to get to those wild places, so I often use a special boat. It's a pretty amazing piece of technology. When I'm not using it, it's small and light enough to fit in my backpack. And when I want to use it, I can just blow air into it and I have a boat.
What did you think of that video? Isn't it amazing and fantastic? What I love is that he's a National Geographic explorer. So if students become interested in him, they can search on the internet, find all kinds of information. But just focusing for a second, did you hear any technology that he called technology that you wouldn't call technology? Again, going back to our assumptions and our idea of what is technology, what is not technology, what we've just been talking about. Was there anything that he called technology that you were like, oh, I normally wouldn't call that technology? Yeah, many people saying the boat, exactly. Overall, I think our students' image of technology is not a boat. When we say technology, they tend to think like computer, smartphone, a Kindle or some kind of like laptop, desktop, small device, not a boat. But certainly in his description, calling it technology actually made sense. It's so cool that it folds up into a little backpack. So here is the mind map that my students and I made together. They made it, we talked about it. You can see that there are 3 colors because it took us 3 times to watch the video and sort of get some of the information. After this is where we got into the explaining activity. So I asked students to think about words in the mind map that they couldn't substitute easily. So like backpack, we could say bag. But if we think about a grave, there was nothing that I could have said as one word. I could have said cemetery, but that's pretty different than grave. The French student might have gotten the idea, might have. So there are some words that we just need to explain that we can't just substitute with one word. Of course, most of these things we could show a picture, and we all have devices. But when I do this with my students, I don't let them use their devices because I want them to build the skill, because it's hard to show a picture of important. So even if they're working on things like a phone and a battery, a boat, they could show a picture, but then they haven't developed that skill of explaining it so that they're ready when it's an abstract idea, like important. So these are the words that my students chose. And they said, these are the words I think we would have to explain. Kind of interesting, right? They chose boat. In fact, you and I would probably say ship, dinghy, raft. There would be some things we could come up with, but my students said boat. And that actually is one of the results I want to share with you. The students got together in pairs and they talked about like, how can we explain this? and then they shared their ideas. The students came up with the vehicle, which we can ride on from place to place on the ocean. What do you think of this explanation? Remember, the point of explaining a boat is not to be technical. You're not giving a lecture. It's to actually overcome some awkward silence or gap, or the person having a different image, too technical, yeah, too long, yeah, right? The point of explaining isn't that you give a very precise definition of boat. The point is simply that the other person has a different image, so you're trying to explain it to them, or they don't know what a boat is, so you're trying to explain it to them. So it's too technical, it's too long. It has a word like vehicle, which, you know, is not going to be one of those words that tons of people know, probably. So I reminded students why we were practicing this skill. It's to facilitate communication. And, oh, yeah, okay. They'd forgotten. I think that's natural, because when students are used to explaining things, if they've had a lot of practice with this, it might have been to get ready for tests, multiple choice tests, where you have to be more specific. But for communication, sometimes it's okay to be a little narrower, a little broader, a little less specific, as long as we're aiding the communication and really the other person understands. So the students had to work again to try and come up with a way to explain boat. And this is what they finally came up with. They couldn't let go of vehicle. So again, we had a little discussion, and they couldn't find a way to get rid of vehicle. So I suggested to them that they could say a thing to move on water. So I reminded them that some people have never seen the ocean, but boats can go on lakes, they can go on rivers. So maybe we should make it more general, because what if the person I'm talking to is from the middle of the United States, has never seen a boat in the ocean, but we say water, then that might help them have a better image, understand what we're trying to talk about. The other thing that was amazing to them, yeah, it's part of critical thinking. Exactly. Thank you. Another thing that was surprising to them is thing. They weren't really used to using thing as just a very general word. After we did this activity, I kept drawing back to it. Remember when we talked about boat? Sometimes we can be very general. Thing was used a lot that semester. So this is one activity to help students think about how to explain stuff. And it's something that we can do at the end of a reading, during vocabulary. We don't have to have students make a mind map to do it. I just used it with a mind map. It can be just one word that we're pulling out and asking students to explain. A second activity to help students get ready for that intercultural communication, to be thinking about when there's this gap, how can we overcome it, is to ask students about words we can substitute. So for backpack, we could say bag. Anybody want to share some ideas, thinking about the words here that we could substitute? For example, in the online thesaurus, important has over 50 words that we can substitute. Some of them a little closer in meaning than others, some of them pretty complicated, but 50 words. So as we're asking students, batteries, energy cell, yeah, thank you. Any others that you would think about rephrasing or substituting? For example, carry could be move. Carry could be take. Carry could be bring, right? Many things we can do. So as we're doing this, we can also help students. Okay, so I substituted technical words for important, and they didn't understand. So maybe I need to have another word. So carry, take, bring, something like that, right? So one way we can emphasize that is by choosing one word and asking students individually, pairs, groups, to brainstorm as many words as they can, 30 seconds. Again, competition. Try to get as many as you can. And then the team with the most words after 30 seconds gets to share their words with the class. But the rest of the teams all check off their ideas so that if they have ideas that nobody else had, then they get to share them as well. So this whole activity only takes 2 or 3 minutes, but students have realized, oh, when I said carry, I said bring. But when they said carry, they said take. And then when somebody else said carry, they said move something. So if I say bring instead, and the other person is still confused, it's not necessarily that my pronunciation's bad. In fact, it's not. It's just that maybe they still don't understand. Try another way. So this is another activity we can do, very competitive, just like that Kahoot, right? The students get very excited because it's competitive. Everybody wants to try to be number one. So that's a really important part of brainstorming and imagining. And that is something that researchers say is very fundamental in helping people communicate, because we're trying to understand the other person. We're trying to imagine what they want to say. So our brain is working overtime to fill in the gaps as much as we can. The last activity that focuses on vocabulary and helping students be able to rephrase and explain and substitute is called Password. Does anybody know the game Password? Have you ever played this before? Even I know adults that play it, even native speakers with native speakers, as a game. Yeah, right. They don't feel like their brain is working. Sometimes they switch off. Exactly. For some people, you know, it can be exhausting to be sort of trying to come up with many words, which is why if we sort of help our students think it's fun, then they'll think of this as a skill. And we can keep tying that back. We can say, oh, remember when we did, you know, the 50 words for important? It can be kind of fun. Think about those words when you're communicating. So they're going to be thinking about those words when they play Password as well. Password is a game where I have a word and I give you 1-word hints. This is the tricky part, only 1-word hints. And you have to guess my word. So I realize you haven't watched the video, you haven't studied this, but you see this amazing photo. I'm going to give you some hints. See if you can guess my word. It's kind of like 20 questions exactly. My first hint is exciting. What could be exciting based on this photo? Adventure. Oh, you are so close. You are so close. Do. Now, what do you think it is? Travel. Adventure was closer. Tour, extreme sport, explore. These are great ideas. Yes, thank you, thank you. Last hint, person. So adventure was very, very close. Adventurer, explorer. Yes, the answer was adventurer. So many people guessed adventure towards the beginning, but there were a lot of other fantastic guesses, including adrenaline rush. Thank you. Absolutely. The problem with starting with exciting is it's not very specific. But if we can start with something specific, for example, if I want to explain a strawberry, I could start with yummy, or I could start with fruit. Fruit is going to narrow down the possibilities and help the other person sort of start to imagine much more quickly than yummy, because yummy is every single food that exists. So when we're doing this activity, we should let students have fun, but then we can talk about what made it easy or what made it difficult for your partner or your group to guess, or what could we do to make it easier? Of course, if the goal is to not let the other group guess, then of course you're going to make it vague. But in real communication, the goal is for them to understand quickly, right? So we can build that in, that they have to think specifically about how to make it a little smoother, make it a little faster. We can give an award for the group that guessed the most quickly. You can imagine with strawberry, it would take 2, 3 hints and they might get it, right? So this is the third activity that is focused on helping students develop those skills for explaining words, rephrasing, substituting, dealing with Sometimes when you and the speaker, or when they and the listener, when they and the speaker have different vocabulary, or vocabulary that's not understandable for them for whatever reason. The last set of activities deals with back channeling. If you think back to that Thai student, one of the things that she said is that she said she would say, is back channeling. When I talk about back channeling with my students, I never say the word back channeling. It's a complicated word. It's unnecessarily difficult, and they're never going to use it. But I might say something like reactions. When I talk about reply, yes, fantastic. That's a great word for explaining back channeling. Back channeling is not only a good skill to help the person that you're talking with know you're engaged, you're interested, you're not bored, but it's also a good skill that you can use if you want to help the other person keep talking. And that can be handy sometimes for our students. So helping them develop this back channeling can be a way for them to keep the conversation going longer without feeling so much stress. Because we hope that students move away from question, answer, and you, question, answer, to something with a little more depth. And back channeling is going to help them do that. So before we really get started studying back channeling, the students are coming into my classroom, and I say, before class starts, just get together with a partner, chat. Talk about what you've done recently or what you're going to do this weekend. And they just chat. When class starts, I ask a couple people to share their ideas, what they're going to do or what their partner said. And then I say, okay, you were talking for 3 minutes or 5 minutes. In that 3 or 5 minutes, did your partner sit completely silently? No reaction, no sound. They laugh. Of course they laugh, because in Japan, just like in every country, there's a lot of back channeling. There's some nodding or I'm confused. And there's sounds, right? We do that naturally in our first language. And so the students realize, oh, I know what back channeling is without me even really explaining it. They also understand that they already do it. Then we spend a minute talking about, how would you feel if your partner hadn't reacted? How do you think you would feel if you were talking? Or as teachers, when you're teaching a class, if your class isn't nodding, isn't raising their hand, has a completely blank face for 10 or 15 minutes, how do you feel? Frustrating. Yeah. Anybody feel like, oh my goodness, are they understanding? If I see that, it doesn't take 10 or 15 minutes. It doesn't take me long to say, does anybody have a question? Okay, get into pairs, talk about what's happening, make sure you confirm this assignment or whatever's happening. And then I go around and try to find out what's going on. So students can talk about the impression they make. As a non-native speaker, one impression that they might be making is that they just don't understand. And that might not be true. It might be that they're just not reacting. When our students are communicating in English, they have to think about so many things. They have to attend mentally to what they're being told. Do they understand it? How are they going to reply? When are they going to reply? What language should they use? What grammar should they use? Is their vocabulary right? Is their pronunciation right? If you think about it, it's kind of overwhelming, all the things that they have to attend to. So it's not surprising that they're not back channeling, because they are spending their energy on something else. It's also not because we don't teach it, because we teach things like quite often. So this activity right now, short utterances, yeah, exactly, that we want them to think about short utterances. Wow, really? To keep the conversation going. So this activity that I'm going to share with you, I've been doing with both videos and listening. It's a little bit artificial, and I'll admit that, but I've been having good results. So that's why I'm sharing it. After we study the page, students understand the material really, really well. We've done the listening. I ask them to take the script, which I pass out, and just mark where might they react. So they don't even have to worry about doing anything, just mark where might they react. So I'm going to play this amazing audio, and I'd like you to just think for a second, where might you react?
Ellie De Castro.
One of the most memorable places I've stayed was in Lucerne, Switzerland. We were on a family holiday with my grandmother. It was winter in Switzerland, which is much, much colder than the tropical Philippines. So we packed all the warm clothes that we had. When we got there, it was freezing, and we had to walk uphill through snow to our hostel. But it was worth it. The views from the enormous windows were spectacular. My grandmother stayed in the hostel for the rest of our trip because she didn't want to climb that hill again. In terms of work, I have slept in all sorts of places, in tents and hammocks, and had some awful nights on bus seats and chairs, and woken up lots of times with insect bites. Of all of these, the best memories are the times that I get to sleep in the homes of teammates. It's much nicer to stay with friends than in a hot tent or on a cold bench. Their homes are often less comfortable than a hotel. I usually sleep on the floor, but they are the friendliest places to stay and the ones I like the most.
Isn't that amazing? She is such a good storyteller. Yeah, somebody just said that in the chat box as well. It was so nice. Yeah, you could hear her Filipino accent. Yeah, I love that students naturally get to hear different accents. So the storytelling that she did helps us make this beautiful image of climbing the mountain. There's a lot of empathy, right? That this poor grandmother, so cold, she doesn't want to go outside. So there are a lot of places where we might react. But before I ask students to get together with a partner and talk about where they might react, I share something like this with them. I asked 3 teachers, so you can see there's blue and yellow and green, one for each teacher. Where would you react? But I don't just have them do it passively. I actually play the audio. I've done this with video, played the video. I record them so I can watch again and again so that I can color code this. Think about where are they reacting with their face, with their body, with words, so verbal and nonverbal. And I show this to students before they ever start discussing where they reacted. Is there anything you notice about these different reactions, the 3 different people? I not only color coded them because for me, it makes it easy to scan, but I also use symbols in case there are any students who maybe have some color deficiency and maybe the colors are more difficult for them. Is there anything you notice? Any differences between the 3 or any similarities between the 3? It's really fast to be sort of skimming through it, but if you start looking, you'll see there are some places where only one person reacts, some places where all 3 react. Sometimes there are exclamation points. So the teacher reacted by saying, yeah, yellow seems more responsive. Yeah, exactly. So, the amount that they're reacting is very different. You can see the exclamation points as well, right? The exclamation points are when a teacher said something like, wow. But even if you look after hammocks, one teacher said, wow, but another teacher said, really, or something like that. So we can see lots of individual differences. The reason I do this is because I want students to realize there's no one right answer. Too much of our education focuses on, maybe not too much, but a lot of our education focuses on testing. One right answer, everything else is wrong. But this is communication. So I want students to think about there's not a right answer. It's individualistic, because what surprises me might not surprise you. What's interesting to me might not be interesting to you. So I'm reacting where it pulls at me. So this is a discussion you can have this day. But again, this is one of those things that you want to keep building. So you do it just a little bit, and then you do it again. So at some point, talk about, why did you react? Where did you react? How do you react? You wouldn't have to do that today. You could do that with another class, or you could just have a few ways that students react. Wow, really? Uh-huh. And then little by little be adding on. Okay, now we're going to do reacting again, or like somebody said in the chat, replying. So as you're doing this, here's 2 new words that you might want to use. One place where this is really helpful is when students are doing dialogue. It's not reading practice. This is not boring. This is interesting, right? We want our students to have it be conversation, not reading. So I always tie back to this. Do you remember the lady who climbed up the mountain in the snow with her grandmother? Remember, you need to react. You need to look up at your partner. You need to use some facial expressions. You need to use some words, because this is practicing real conversation. So the first time you do it, again, it's artificial, but just to give them the practice of reacting, you can ask students to get into pairs. One pair reads because they've studied all the material, they can read it. And the other one just simply reacts in simple ways, physical, verbal reactions, just so they see it's not scary to react. And so they can start to sort of make this way of realizing, oh, we can react. It's not scary. It's not hard. For students who are a little more advanced, when you're working on back channeling, you can also either privately, if you have mixed class, or as a class, be thinking about turn taking. Where would you try and ask a question? So that's quite a bit more advanced, but it's something we can do. There are so many layers that we can add into this back channeling. But again, when we think about those sort of gaps in conversation, this is something that we can just add in to a class for 1 or 2 minutes, but we're just keep building on the skill, reminding them of that. So I just want to bring one last poll out. Today, we've talked about several different things. First of all, increasing awareness of English as a lingua franca, increasing awareness of images are different. We talked about lots of ways to explain, to develop the students' ability to explain words, to rephrase, to substitute, and also this back channeling. So for you, my goal is that you can take something home and you can use it right away this week. You can use it at your school. If you're online and you're teaching from home, you can do that as well. All of these activities don't take a lot of prep time. This one with the asking a couple teachers to react takes a little bit of prep time, but just the 2-minute, let's practice substituting, no prep time. So you can use them quickly and easily. And we can use them again and again in slightly different ways to just help students. Okay, now we're gonna remember this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, so that they keep seeing how it all ties back together. So I'm just going to share these results. It's so fun to see. Everybody has different ideas. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that everybody is finding ways that hopefully you can take this back. We are almost out of time. And I think Andrew wants to say something, but what I want to do is I want to share my email address. If you implement something and you have a victory, please share it with me. Or if you implement something and you have a question, please feel free to email. I'll try to answer as much as I can. Just put in the subject something about webinar so that if it's in my spam folder, I actually see it. I want to thank you all so much for being involved in the chat box. It was so fun to see your comments, to see your ideas, to share different perspectives. And I want to thank you for giving an hour of your time. Andrew, did you have anything last you wanted to say?
I just wanted to say thank you, Carmela. It was really good. And
Okay,
actually, if
fantastic.
people have questions for you, let's see if anyone's got a question or two. But I'm sure everyone appreciated the session as much as we did here. I know 2 or 3 of my colleagues were on this webinar as well, watching in the background.
Fantastic.
So nice to see them here too. But no, thanks,
absolutely.
Carmela.
Thank
just
you.
while we're waiting to see if there's a question or two, I just remind people that we will send out the recording and the certificate tomorrow. Those will come to you tomorrow afternoon. And we'll send a little bit more information about this wonderful program, Voices, that Carmela was using with all these great photographs and videos and audio and other sorts of things that are in there. But no, thank you very much, Carmela. It's great to see you all the way joining us from your hard work at the university in Japan.
Oh, no. Thank you for having me. Such a pleasure to be involved.
That's good. It's good. We'll just wait and see if anyone's got a question in the chat box, maybe, if there's anything you can answer.
Yeah,
but if people do need to head away, feel free.
Yeah, I want to respect everybody's time. It's been an hour, so thank you so much.
That's good. Most people seem pretty happy. Lots of thank yous and some hearts.
Thank you. I love hearts.
Very good. Well,
face. Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. Very good. Well, thank you, everyone. It seems like everyone's happy. But again, you've got Carmela's email there. And if you do have any comments or suggestions, let us know. Or you can pass them to me. You've all got my email address and I'll pass them on to Carmela as well. Very good. Well, thanks, Carmela, once again.
Thank you.
And everybody enjoy the rest of your day. And we'll sign off for now and expect an email from us tomorrow and looking forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Great to see you, Andrew. Bye, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you.